Historically, queerness and non-heterosexual intimacy was depicted as comedic relief, if at all, in cinema. In reviewing more modern films from the general 2000s and 2010s with the films Frida, We the Animals, and Pariah, audiences are able to gather a sense of the good, the bad, and the ugly of modern queer intimacy and representation in film. The films were examined using the film tests explained in my last video, the Bechdel, Victor-Rousseau, and Duvernay tests. These are not definitive ways of evaluating the film and its abilities to portray meaningful, feminist, and diverse stories, though. They serve more as guidelines to be mindful of when watching films and critiquing the work of different directors. 3 scenes have been selected, one from each film, where queer intimacy is shown with the main protagonist. Before we examine each scene, though, some of the similarities between the main queer protagonists are that they all seem to be in films that examine their identities and coming of age as intersectional queer youth, although Frida's was about her whole life. Aside from that, the films couldn't get any more different from each other. The good. Close-ups and shifting stares at each other, soft conversations about dreams of the future, noticing signs of friends being older, then the literal drowning feeling of anxiety, but this time someone to be with underwater. Then finally, following those feelings with that intimate person. Despite not passing the Bechdel test, We the Animals, Jeremiah Zager's 2018 adaptation of Justin Torres' book of the same name, is a good film for queer and Afro-Latinx representation. It can be a tough watch though due to scenes of domestic violence. It passes the Victor-Rousseau and Duvernay tests for these raw depictions though, since they're adapted from some elements of Torres' life. Immediately, the viewer is immersed in the mind of Jonah, the protagonist. Due to his creativity and secret passion for art and writing, the beautiful cinematic portrayals of how he is stuck with anxiety and a drowning feeling are natural and flow well with the story and its themes. He is the youngest and innocent until he meets one of his neighbors, he and his brother's friend, Dustin. He is exposed to porn there and from there has to sort through all his feelings about men and women and his paps and eventually his crush on Dustin. The scene where he finds refuge in Dustin's basement and then kisses him and runs is so wholesome and tackles underage queer young men's experiences with their sexuality in an appropriate way. It is left unclear what Dustin's reaction was, but regardless, Jonah was happy he was able to get over the drowning feelings and go for it. The bad. As an audience member, you know right away with the revolving door part something is up. Next, Frida obviously stands out in this 20s white diner, but it seems to arouse no controversy or disturbance. The diner itself has a lot of red, and so are the flowers on Gracie's dress, adding to the lust motifs. Gracie pours alcohol from a flask into their coffees. Then the ball drops. Then the camera pans down under the table as Frida leans in close and is seen doing things. Gracie smiles but is hesitant and reserved. The 2002 film Frida is a beautiful and artistic film, but it misses many marks with queer representation and has tropes that over-sexualize Latinx women for the male gaze. I was surprised to find out it was directed by a woman, Julie Taymor. The film didn't pass the Bechdel test until 6 minutes in, but the viewers had already seen 2 pairs of breasts. Despite my harsh critique, I would still say that the film passes the Victor-Rousseau and Duvernay tests, since Frida's Mexican and bisexual identities were not shied from. However, Frida's moments of queer intimacy are almost all overshadowed by being somehow tied to her male love interest Diego, who is 20 years older than her. The scene in the diner where Frida is with a woman she is implied to have just been intimate with is particularly off because it causes conflicting feelings for me. While Frida's clearly a young bisexual woman acting of her own free will in the scene, the conversation was about sleeping with Diego and why she puts up with him, as well as how the other woman had slept with him as well. The setting was public and the consent was unclear. It was an odd scene and it felt more like it was catering to the male gaze, rather than depicting a meaningful representation of consensual queer intimacy. The ugly. Dim lighting with fairy lights, an intimate setting with someone who seems interested in the same way, gentle reassurance, kisses and soft touch, but then there's the next day. Full natural lighting, the harsh cold shoulder of the next day reality. Nothing can have happened. Then pain, raw and unfiltered, rage and pain, betrayal and destruction. Now, when I say ugly in this context, it's in the term of ugly truth. Director Dee Rees, a queer woman of color, portrays the complicated connection and intimacy can have with self-discovery for queer youth in all its ugliest truths in the 2011 film Pariah. For a lot of people, intimacy can provide a sense of comfort, a reminder that you're not alone in feeling the feelings you have. However, when they're brushed aside right after and told to keep the encounter a secret, this can be very damaging. Felicia, the young trans Native American in my last video from the film Drunktown's Finest, also faces similar struggles, but with men rather than women. For Alike in Pariah, this acts as the domino which causes her to break down after rushing home. She's shown talking back to her mother, screaming and wrecking her room, then sobbing alone among her trash things. It's ugly and painful, and it feels real. You can feel her anguish in the performance. The tone is completely shifted from the previous sense of comfort and trust. Ultimately, it seems that as time progresses, queer stories become more realistic and intimate. This is due to the direct involvement of people who have lived experiences when depicting stories with similar narratives.